Looking at our second learning approach. The last one was looking at behaviorism. This one is known as social learning theory, or SLT for short. This happy chap here is Ventura. He is the predominant researcher and theorist. And this here is the Bobo doll. And this video we're going to be explaining exactly why we have that creepy blow-up clown in our classroom. So, this man here, Ventura, he believed that behaviour was learned from our experiences, just like the other learning theorists, but he argued that behaviour could be acquired not just through direct experience, but also by observing and imitating the behaviour of other people. Hence why this is social learning theory, because we learn socially by observing and imitating those around us. So let's have a look at the key assumptions here of social learning theory. So again, social learning theory argues that we don't need to directly experience the consequences of behaviour in order to learn. So we don't need to experience punishments and reinforcement personally in order to learn from that behaviour. We can learn by watching or observing the behaviour of other people and the consequences, the reinforcement or punishment that follows their behaviour. Therefore, this is known as vicarious learning, learning via others. So if a person observes somebody's behaviour and positive consequences follow that behaviour, i.e. that behaviour is reinforced, they're learning via vicarious reinforcement. So they haven't been reinforced themselves, but they've watched somebody else be reinforced for that behaviour. We can also learn via vicarious punishment. So if we watch the behaviour of another person and that behaviour is punished, for example, if you see somebody in class getting told off for not doing their homework, you are also going to learn from that, and you're also less likely to not do your homework. What you've experienced there is vicarious punishment. So you've learned via watching the behaviour and the punishment of others. So we don't have to directly experience consequences. We can learn from the consequences that follow the behaviour of other people. And that is the idea behind vicarious learning. So individuals who see a model receive reinforcement for the behaviour are themselves more likely to imitate that behaviour. So if we experience vicarious reinforcement, so if we see somebody else getting rewarded for completing their homework to a really high standard, then we ourselves are more likely to imitate that behaviour. So we ourselves are more likely to then hand in homework of a high quality. If we experience vicarious punishment, so if we see somebody else receiving punishment for behaviour, like not handing in their homework, we're less likely to imitate that behaviour. So the same rules of reinforcement and punishment apply here. It's just that we're learning this vicariously. We don't have to experience these consequences for ourselves. We can simply observe the consequences following the behaviour of others. So in order for social learning to take place, someone must carry out or model the attitude or the behaviour to be learned. And individuals that perform this role are referred to as models. And this process is sometimes referred to as modelling for that reason. There are different types of models. We can have live models. So live models would be people in our immediate environment, like parents or members of our peer group or teachers, for example. Or we could have symbolic models. So symbolic models are models that are not in our immediate environment. So for example, someone portrayed in the media, like a character on TV. And the models provide examples of the behaviour or the attitudes that can be observed by the individual, and then later produced by that individual in a process known as imitation. So social learning theory can best be summed up as learning via observation and imitation. One of the key determinants of whether a behaviour is likely to be imitated are the characteristics of the model, so the person who we are observing. We're most likely to copy models who are similar to us or have desirable characteristics, and we're going to look at this process of identification a little bit later on. Some other key assumptions of social learning theory, again, is that learning is a social process, so we're learning via others, we're learning via the models that are in our environment, and that cognition is involved in learning. We're going to be looking at the different mediational processes involved in learning. This is the idea that we don't just learn via stimulus and response models, like the behaviourists argued, but actually there's cognition involved in learning. So we're going to be having a look at those cognitive processes in just a moment. So these cognitive processes are referred to as mediational processes. So social learning theory differs from behaviourism and the other learning approaches in that it places special importance on these internal mental processes. So think of social learning theory as the combination between behaviourism and the cognitive approach. So Bandura agreed with the behaviourists. They argued that yes, we learn from our experiences and we learn from our environment, but Bandura thought that this ignored the role of mental processes, which we know that came about around the same time as social learning theory. So once we had the cognitive approach, very soon the social learning approach followed. So he recognised that we don't just learn from the consequences that follow our own behaviour, but we learn from observing the consequences that follow other people's behaviour as well. So Bandura claimed that in order for social learning to take place, we have to form mental representations of the behaviour that's displayed by the model. And we have to form mental representations of the consequences that follow that behaviour. And we might store these mental representations for days, weeks, months, decades, before the opportunity to perform the behaviour actually arises. So unlike rats in a Skinner box, we don't just unconsciously and immediately respond to a stimulus in our environment. Sometimes we're unable to or unmotivated to imitate the behaviour for some time. So for example, you might watch for years and years and years how to perform a serve in tennis by watching Wimbledon for years and years. But until you're actually there with the racket in your hand, you don't have the opportunity to imitate that behaviour that you've observed. So Bandura argued that we must be storing mental representations of observed behaviour in order to then imitate it years later. So when that appropriate opportunity arises in the future, the individual might perform that learned behaviour if they can expect reinforcement. So this is where the ideas of vicarious learning also come in terms of vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment. Alright, so Bandura argued that human learning is not as simple as stimulus and response. We're not just responding to a bell by salivating in our environment. There's cognition involved. Something is happening between stimulus and response. And these are known as the mediational processes. These are describing what happens between observing the behaviour and performing it. And these processes are known as mediational processes. So let's have a look at these. So, the four mental factors, or the four cognitive factors, between observation and imitation, first of all is attention. So whether we're likely to imitate a behaviour or not after we've observed it is going to depend on how much we notice that behaviour, how much we pay attention to the behaviour of the model. We're more likely to pay attention to behaviour performed by models who are similar to us, so identification is important here. We're going to look at this again in just a moment. But there are other factors that are also going to determine the attention that we pay to a behaviour. So for instance, if that behaviour is novel, if it's eye-catching, if it's performed by a famous celebrity in an advertisement, for example, we're more likely to pay attention to that behaviour. And this is why often in ads they will have celebrity endorsements and they will play jingles along with the ad just to make it interesting and novel and to make it stand out so that you can pay attention to it and therefore imitate the behaviour of the model by buying the product, for example. The next mediational process is retention. We must store the mental representation of the behaviour in our long-term memory. As we said before, we don't immediately perform behaviour that we observe, we only perform it when the opportunity arises in the future. And so between that time, between observing that behaviour and having the opportunity to imitate that behaviour, we have to store it in our long-term memory. And there's a few different things that are going to affect how well we store that memory. Obviously, how much attention we paid to it in the beginning, but whether we've been able to repeat or rehearse that information, how much time has passed since you observed that behaviour, etc., is all going to affect your retention of that information. The next mediational process is motor reproduction, and this is the ability to perform the behaviour. This is going to depend on a few factors like how physically capable you are of imitating that behaviour, so whether you've got the strength and the flexibility, for example, how easy that behaviour is to perform. If it's seen as really difficult, then it's not going to be possible to perform it. So, I mean, for example, you could observe a slam dunk on the NBA as many times as you like, but unless you're 6.5 feet tall and have the flexibility and the strength to actually perform it, you're not going to be able to, and you're probably not going to try. And finally, the last mediational process is motivation. So this is the will to imitate the behaviour. So this is going to depend on the vicarious learning that you've experienced. So if you see the model rewarded or reinforced for their behaviour, for example, scoring an ace in tennis or scoring the slam dunk in basketball, then you're more likely to imitate that behaviour because you've experienced vicarious reinforcement. If you see the model punished for their behaviour, so for instance they miss the shot or they don't do their homework and they get a detention, then you're less likely to imitate that behaviour. And so this is to do with the rewards and the punishments for that behaviour and whether you think you're likely to experience those same rewards and punishments. Alright, so we're going to come back to some other processes involved in social learning theory in just a moment, but I'd like to go through now one of the key pieces of research. Typically you're going to be using this in your AO3, just as supportive evidence for social learning theory, but it's conceivable that it could come up as a question on its own as well. Alright, so this is Bandura's famous Bobo doll research, and this is why this creepy dude sits in our classroom. So, I want to take you through the procedure. This isn't really essential knowledge, but it's important just to see the setup because it's a really sophisticated study, and it's worth knowing this so you can evaluate it later on. So, the sample of Bandura's study, he had 36 girls and 36 boys take part in the study. They're all from Stanford University Nursery School, and they were ranging from 3 to 6 years old. The mean age was about 4.4 months old. The 3 experimental conditions. So these participants were randomly allocated to one of 3 different conditions. The first condition is the aggressive model condition. So 24 of those children were exposed to an aggressive model. 24 of the children were exposed to a non-aggressive model. And 3 of the children were in the control, so 24 of the children were in the control group. So they didn't witness a model. I'll talk about what this means in just a second, once we've looked at the actual setup of this experiment. Alright, so if we just break this down a little bit further then, so we had, in the aggressive model condition, we had a male model and we had a female model. So 12 of those children watched a male model, 12 a female model. Likewise in the non-aggressive condition, and of course there was no model in the control condition. So what this means then is that you end up with a really sophisticated design where we can look at not just the type of model that was observed, aggressive or non-aggressive, but we can also look at the gender of the model. We can also look at whether boys are more likely to imitate male models or female models. And this is because by the end, what we've got here is 6 boys watching a male aggressive model, and we've got 6 girls watching a male aggressive model. Here we've got 6 boys watching a female aggressive model and 6 girls watching a female aggressive model. Over in the non-aggressive model condition now, so we've got 6 boys who are watching a male non-aggressive model and 6 girls watching a male non-aggressive model. Now I've got 6 boys watching a female non-aggressive model and 6 girls watching a female non-aggressive model. And then of course we've still got 24 children, so 12 boys and 12 girls in the control condition with no model. So that's how the experiment was set up, and that's how we were able to test so many different independent variables. So let's have a look at actually what Bandura did. So the aim of this research was to investigate whether behaviours, social behaviours like aggression, can be acquired via social learning, via observation and imitation. So we set up this really sophisticated design. So the procedure involved 3 different stages. Stage 1 was the modelling stage. So children were put into a room for about 10 minutes or so, and they had a few toys to play with. And in that room there was a model. So as we saw before, they were either exposed to an aggressive model, a non-aggressive model, or for those children who were in the control group, there was no model. They were just in the room playing with those toys. So the children who watched an aggressive model, they would see this model violently attack the Bobo doll. So it would be kicking it, verbally abusing it, saying things like pow and take that, and he sure is a tough fella, and some really typically 60s kind of phrases there, and also hitting the Bobo doll with a mallet. So quite simple behaviours to observe, but things that the children would have been unlikely to have seen if they weren't observing that model. If the children that were observing the non-aggressive model, they would just see the person playing with the other toys or playing with the Bobo doll in a nice sort of friendly manner. So, after 10 minutes or so of observing the model, the children were then taken to another room, and this is the aggression arousal condition, or stage, sorry. So this is where they were deliberately intending to frustrate the children to draw out their aggression. So they were taken to a room with some really attractive toys, so things that they really wanted to play with, and they were told that they weren't allowed to touch them. They weren't allowed to play with those toys. They were then transferred to another room, and this time their behaviour was observed. And this time the researchers were testing to see whether they were imitating this behaviour. So they were here for about 20 minutes or so, and the behaviour of the children was observed and recorded. And these are the findings, and this is the important part here, because these findings are the ones that support social learning theory and the idea that we learn via observation and imitation. So, some key findings here. The children who were exposed to the aggressive model were more likely to imitate aggressive acts. So those that saw the model hitting the Bobo doll were themselves much more likely to hit the Bobo doll. Those that were not exposed to an aggressive model, so watched the non-aggressive model or no model, were unlikely to hit or kick or verbally abuse the Bobo doll. So those children were imitating the aggressive model. Another interesting finding is that boys were more physically aggressive than girls. Boys performed 2 times the number of aggressive acts than girls did. I'm going to come back to that when we look at evaluation. So for now, I just want you to think, why could that be? Why were boys more aggressive than girls? And can that be explained by social learning theory? And then finally, now not strictly a finding from this research, but in a follow-up study, they provided either reinforcement or punishment to the model. So they were looking here at the process of vicarious learning. And they found that when the model was rewarded for being aggressive to the Bobo doll, the children were even more likely to show aggressive behaviours towards that Bobo doll than if the model was punished for being aggressive to the Bobo doll. So we learn then via vicarious reinforcement, we're more likely to imitate the behaviour if the model is reinforced for aggressive behaviour. So this is the key piece of research, for social learning theory, and it's a very, very famous study. Alright, so finally some last key terms that are necessary for your glossary and necessary for understanding the processes of social learning theory. So, a key process is identification. So identification refers to the extent to which an individual relates to a model and feels that he or she is similar to that model. In order to identify with the model, we must feel that we're similar enough to that model that we would be likely to experience the same consequences that the model did. So if we saw the model being reinforced, we feel like we too, because we're similar to that model, would also be reinforced for that behaviour, and similarly for punishment. So children, and actually indeed all of us, are more likely to identify models who are similar to us. So particularly same-sex models, we're likely to imitate, we're likely to observe and imitate. Models that have desirable characteristics like fame or wealth or beauty, for example, and those that have high status. So this is why celebrities are typically used to endorse products, because we're likely to pay attention to them, we're likely to identify with them, and therefore we're likely to imitate them by buying the products that we can see they're using. And as we spoke about earlier, we can have live models that we identify with, or we can have symbolic models. It doesn't matter whether they're physically present in the environment or not, we can still identify with fictional models on TV, for example. And this is why it's so important that children are watching positive role models on TV, and this is why they have classifications and ratings like PG and G games, because children are likely to observe the behaviours that they're seeing in those television programmes and then imitate them, particularly if they identify with that model. So, social learning theory, just to sum up, is learning via observation and imitation. So we learn via the consequences that we see models receiving. So we are likely to observe models who are similar to us, who we identify with, and then if that model is rewarded for behaviour, we're likely to also imitate that behaviour, but if the model is punished, then we're less likely to imitate that behaviour. Another key is the idea of the mediational processes. So we're not like rats in Skinner's box. We don't just immediately respond to stimuli in our environment. There's cognition involved. So because there's often quite a long time period between observing the behaviour and having the opportunity to imitate it, we form mental representations of that behaviour. And the four mediational processes, attention, retention, motor reproduction, and reinforcement. Sorry, attention, retention, motor reproduction, and motivation dictate whether we're likely to imitate that behaviour.